On the 17th day of September, in the year 2025, the world witnessed a thunderclap in the heart of New York City. Inside the chamber of the United Nations General Assembly, a voice rose, not trembling, not pleading, but burning with the fire of centuries of injustice. That voice belonged to Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. For 47 minutes he spoke, and with each sentence the walls of that chamber seemed to shake. He was not there to flatter the powerful or to seek their permission. He was there to speak for 28 million Burkinabé and for 1.4 billion Africans who refuse to be treated as second-class members of humanity. He declared that the very institution called the United Nations, created after the Second World War, has too often served the interests of the victors of 1945 rather than the hopes of the oppressed. Then came the charge, heavy as iron, sharp as lightning. France has drained $847 billion from Burkina Faso since 1960 through currency control, forced trade, and resource plunder. And with the full authority of his people behind him, Traoré demanded reparations. Not tomorrow, not someday, but now. He warned the assembly that if justice was not done, Africa would have no choice but to walk out of the institutions that legitimize its suffering. Brothers and sisters, the hall fell silent. Western diplomats froze in their seats. And then, from the delegations of Africa, a roar of applause rose like a storm. 32 nations stood, joined by China, Russia, India, Brazil, and others. For 12 long minutes, the chamber thundered with approval, while the West sat still, exposed, and speechless. And yet, my friends, that was only the beginning. The world will remember that day not as routine diplomacy, but as the moment when Africa rose to speak its truth before all nations. It was the 17th of September, 2025. At precisely 2:47 in the afternoon, Eastern Standard Time, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso approached the podium of the United Nations General Assembly. He was not dressed in the polished suits of the diplomats. He carried himself as a soldier, as a son of Africa, as a messenger of a wounded people. He began with words that cut like a sword. Distinguished delegates, I stand before you not as a supplicant seeking Western approval, but as the voice of 28 million Burkinabé and 1.4 billion Africans who refuse to accept that this United Nations serves anyone other than the colonial powers that have exploited our continent for centuries. With that declaration, the mask of polite diplomacy was torn away. For 78 long years, he reminded them, this organization has legitimized the extraction of resources, the military interventions, and the impoverishment of the global South, all while protecting the same 5 nations who hold permanent veto power because they won a war 80 years ago. Then, like a prophet bringing charges against empire, Traoré laid out his case. He spoke of the Communauté Financière Africaine franc system, through which France has compelled Burkina Faso and 14 other African nations to deposit half of their foreign reserves into the French treasury. That system alone, he declared, has siphoned $312 billion directly from Africa into the coffers of Paris. He did not speak vaguely. He brought numbers, records, calculations made by African economists and international legal experts. He laid bare the theft of Africa's gold, 285 billion taken with only 12 billion retained. He named uranium stripped from the Sahel at 89 billion in value, while a mere 4 billion was paid back. He recited the story of cotton, 74 billion worth extracted over 65 years, processed in French factories, sold back at inflated prices. He counted manganese, other minerals, all taken with almost no local benefit. When all accounts were settled, the total extraction reached $847 billion. And then came the thunder. Today, I formally demand that this General Assembly establish a reparations tribunal with binding authority to order France to compensate Burkina Faso for 6 decades of systematic exploitation. If the United Nations refuses, it proves that this body exists not for justice, but to shield colonial powers. And Africa will have no choice but to withdraw. Brothers and sisters, imagine the weight of those words in that chamber. The ultimatum was clear: reparations or an African withdrawal from the United Nations system. No more symbolic speeches, no more patient petitions. This was a line drawn in history. But Captain Traoré did not stop there. He reached deeper, striking at the very foundation of the institution. He spoke of the Security Council, where 5 nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, hold permanent veto power over the destinies of 8 billion souls. He called it tyranny, a system where Africa, with 54 nations and 1.4 billion people, holds no permanent seat, while France, with 68 million, can block any resolution on African security. He named it plainly. This is not governance. This is institutionalized imperialism. Then his voice turned to the so-called development institutions, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. He denounced them as tools of economic colonialism, enforcing structural adjustment programs that stripped Africa of industries, privatized resources, and indebted generations. He reminded the assembly of how Libya, once the most prosperous African state, was shattered under NATO bombs in the name of responsibility to protect. He asked, where was the United Nations' responsibility to protect Libyans from Western fire? The chamber grew still. Traoré's words were not the polished language of diplomats. They were the raw indictment of centuries. He spoke with the authority of history, the evidence of economists, the cry of a continent. He accused the United Nations of becoming not the House of Peace, but the courtroom where empire dresses itself in legal robes. The hall held its breath. Cameras captured the faces of diplomats, some shifting uncomfortably, some bowing their heads. And then it happened, the standing ovation. 32 African delegations rose as one body. Their applause shook the chamber for 12 unbroken minutes. Representatives from China, Russia, India, Brazil joined the chorus. Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, North Korea cheered with open defiance. And across the aisle, the Western delegation sat frozen, lips tight, hands still, unable to refute the accusations, unable to clap for the truth. Even Secretary General Antonio Guterres, sitting high on the dais, was visibly unsettled. The division of the world stood revealed in that moment. The global South, on its feet, united and alive with hope. The West, silent, exposed, stripped of its moral authority. Yet, brothers and sisters, this was not theater. This was not noise for headlines. This was the voice of Africa calling out the injustice of an entire world system and offering a vision of something new. And what followed next would shake the very foundations of international law itself. Brothers and sisters, there comes a moment in history when silence is no longer possible, when the truth spoken aloud shakes every corner of the earth. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had already exposed the theft, already calculated the debt, already demanded justice. But then, in front of the entire world, he delivered the ultimatum that set the chamber ablaze. If this United Nations refuses to act on reparations, if this body proves itself to be nothing more than a shield for colonial powers, then Africa will have no choice but to withdraw from institutions that legitimize our continued exploitation. That was not a suggestion. That was not a whisper. That was a threat as old as freedom itself. Either justice is delivered or Africa walks away. And in that instant, the chamber cracked wide open. The division between North and South, between colonizer and colonized, was no longer hidden behind handshakes and polished speeches. It stood visible to all. The applause rose again, fierce and unrelenting. 32 African delegations clapped until their hands were raw. They did not clap politely. They rose to their feet as if standing in court, declaring with their bodies that the verdict had been given. For 12 long minutes, their voices echoed through that chamber. 12 minutes that felt like 12 years of compressed rage and defiance. But they were not alone. From the delegations of China, Russia, India, Brazil, applause joined, heavy and deliberate. Cuba and Venezuela raised their fists. Iran and North Korea cheered loudly, unashamed. It was as if the oppressed of the world had found a single voice, and they were determined to make it heard. On the other side of the hall, silence sat like a shadow. The United States delegation shifted uneasily, their faces carved in stone. France's representatives clenched their jaws, refusing to move. Britain sat stiff, their eyes cast downward. Germany's diplomats whispered among themselves, careful not to meet the gaze of their counterparts. The West, so loud when issuing lectures, was suddenly struck mute when confronted with its crimes. And there, at the center of it all, Secretary General Antonio Guterres tried to maintain composure. Cameras caught him shifting in his seat, lips tight, eyes restless. He knew that history was being written and that the institution he represented had been dragged into the light. Traoré did not stop with accusations. He came with evidence. He cited international law, United Nations Resolution 1514 on decolonization, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, precedents from the International Court of Justice. He reminded them that international law itself recognizes reparations for systematic exploitation. His demand was not wild rhetoric. It was a case, calculated, documented, legally grounded. Western delegations had no rebuttal. They could not deny the numbers. They could not erase the history. They could not silence the applause that thundered around them. But the true climax of his speech was not only the demand for $847 billion. It was the vision he laid before the world, the Global South Assembly. He proposed an institution built not on the privilege of 5 nations, but on the equality of all. He proposed a democratic body where decisions would be made by majority vote, where no empire could veto the will of billions. He called for a South-South development bank, free from the conditionalities that enslave economies. He outlined a global South court to adjudicate disputes and hear claims of exploitation. He described a decolonization commission to monitor and reverse the practices of modern imperialism. And then he named the date, the 15th of December, 2025. Ouagadougou, the birthplace of Thomas Sankara, would host the founding conference of the Global South Assembly. He invited all nations of the South to attend, to confirm participation by the 1st of November, to choose solidarity over submission. The chamber trembled. Imagine it. A new institution representing 6.5 billion people rising in defiance of the old. If 100 countries joined, the Global South Assembly would hold more legitimacy than the Western Bloc itself. For the first time since 1945, the monopoly of the West stood on the brink of collapse. Outside the chamber, reactions spread like wildfire. China's representative declared, "Captain Traoré speaks truth about a system that serves the few at the expense of the many." Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov affirmed, "The United Nations reflects the power balance of 1945, not the reality of 2025. India and Brazil nodded in agreement, their voices steady, their positions clear. Meanwhile, Western voices faltered. The United States Secretary of State warned of divisive rhetoric. France dismissed the claims as baseless accusations. Britain called the demand historically inaccurate and economically impossible. Germany suggested reforms through existing mechanisms, but their words rang hollow. They could not erase the 12-minute standing ovation, nor the sight of 32 African nations united in one voice. Brothers and sisters, do you see it? In that chamber, the lines of the future were drawn. The Global South, weary of centuries of exploitation, stood up not with weapons, but with law, with evidence, with unity. And the West, accustomed to dominance, could only sit still, exposed before the judgment of the world. But if that moment was a climax, what followed was a wave of consequences that no power could contain. Brothers and sisters, when Captain Traoré stepped down from that podium, the chamber had changed, but so had the world beyond its walls. His words did not remain trapped in the marble halls of New York. They spread, carried on airwaves, printed in headlines, whispered in the corridors of power, shouted in the streets of Ouagadougou, Accra, Lagos, Johannesburg. And the question on every tongue was this: what happens now? For the first time in a living memory, a leader of Africa had presented not just a complaint, not just a protest, but a legally documented claim, a bill, a charge sheet, an accounting of $847 billion drained by colonial hands. If such a claim were accepted, if such reparations were granted, then brothers and sisters, the doors of history would burst wide open, because Burkina Faso was not alone. 14 other nations trapped in the CFA franc system could make the same demand. Former British colonies could calculate their losses, presenting centuries of plunder in hard numbers. Nations of Latin America, still scarred by the Spanish and Portuguese empires, could rise with claims of their own. Indigenous peoples in the Americas, in Australia, in the islands of the Pacific, could present their accounts before the world. Even China, remembering the unequal treaties of the 19th century, could demand restitution. Do you see it? If one claim is recognized, then the avalanche begins. Trillions upon trillions of dollars in reparations could be demanded. The entire balance of global wealth, shifted for centuries from south to north, could be called into question. The West understood this immediately. Their panic was not about Burkina Faso alone. Their panic was about the precedent. For if history is placed on trial, who among the great colonial powers would escape judgment? Yet beyond the fear of the powerful, a new spirit began to move among the nations of the South. For generations, many had believed that justice was impossible, that colonialism was too vast, too entrenched, too buried under time to ever be reversed. But here was a leader, standing at the very center of the world, not only naming the crime, but demanding repayment, demanding repair, demanding restoration. Hope rose. Hope that the pain of the past could be answered by the law of the present. Hope that the children of the South would not always be born into debt and dependency. Hope that Africa, Asia, and Latin America might finally rise on their own terms, free from the yoke of institutions built to serve the North. But brothers and sisters, let us not deceive ourselves. The path of justice is never smooth. The very moment the words left Traoré's mouth, the machinery of resistance began to turn. Western diplomats rushed to private meetings. Phone calls rang through embassies. Promises of aid, threats of sanctions, whispers of isolation were deployed like weapons to break the solidarity of the South. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank hinted at suspending loans for countries daring to support the proposal. Western banks spoke of tightening credit. Corporations began to mutter about withdrawing investments. Even the manipulation of currency was not off the table. The tools of economic warfare, sharpened over decades, were unsheathed once more. At the same time, the media engines roared to life. Headlines in Western papers denounced Traoré's demands as unrealistic, divisive, a threat to international cooperation. Television pundits painted the Global South Assembly as anti-Western, as the work of authoritarian leaders, as dangerous, as reckless. Propaganda dressed as analysis filled the airwaves. And yet, despite the pressure, despite the threats, something had shifted. Across the African continent, parliaments debated openly about reparations. Civil society movements took to the streets, chanting for justice, holding signs with the number 847 billion written in bold. In Latin America, leaders remembered the Bandung Conference of 1955, when Asia and Africa first stood together against imperial dominance. In Asia, voices in India and China spoke of reform, long delayed, long denied. For 70 years, the post-war order had been taken as unshakable, as permanent. But now a crack had appeared. The South had spoken. The North had been confronted. And the idea of a new system was no longer a dream, no longer a whisper, but a concrete proposal with a date, a place, and a plan. So we must ask ourselves, what comes next? Will Africa stand firm under the pressure? Will the nations of the South choose unity over fear, solidarity over bribery, courage over compromise? Will December 15th in Ouagadougou be remembered as the birth of a new world, or as a missed opportunity, another moment lost to hesitation? I put the question to you, brothers and sisters. If you were a leader, if the weight of history was on your shoulders, would you dare to demand reparations? Would you dare to walk away from institutions that refuse to serve justice? Because make no mistake, the choice is not only for presidents and diplomats. The choice belongs to the people. The choice belongs to the young Africans marching in the streets. The choice belongs to the elders who remember the promises of independence unfulfilled. The choice belongs to every nation of the South that must decide whether to remain in the house of empire or to build a house of their own. And as that choice looms, the eyes of the world turn to the United States and the Western powers to see how they will respond to the crumbling of their monopoly. Brothers and sisters, when the thunder of Traoré's words echoed across the globe, every capital city was forced to answer. The chamber in New York had revealed the fault line, the global South standing tall, the West caught in silence. But outside those walls, the battle of narratives began. From Washington came a voice wrapped in polished diplomacy. The United States Secretary of State declared that such rhetoric was divisive and dangerous to international cooperation. Yet beneath those words lay a trembling fear, the fear that America's leadership of the global order was slipping, the fear that Africa was no longer content to play the role written for it in the script of empire. From Paris, the reaction was sharper, colder. France dismissed the demand for $847 billion as baseless accusations. They painted themselves as partners, as friends, speaking of development assistance, while ignoring the centuries of extraction laid bare in the numbers. But their denial only revealed the wound. For no nation protests so loudly unless it feels the weight of truth pressing upon it. From London, the words were smoother, but no less empty. The United Kingdom insisted that reparations were historically inaccurate and economically impossible. Germany added its voice, suggesting that reforms should occur within existing mechanisms, as if the same old structures could suddenly serve justice after decades of silence. Do you see, brothers and sisters? When confronted with evidence, the powers of the West offered only excuses. They could not refute the figures. They could not erase the applause. They could not deny the hypocrisy. They spoke of impossibility because they feared the possibility. But while the West scrambled, the South stood stronger. From Beijing, Ambassador Zhang Jun declared, Captain Traoré speaks truth about an international system that serves the few at the expense of the many. China supports more democratic and representative global governance. From Moscow, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov affirmed, the current United Nations system reflects the power balance of 1945, not the reality of 2025. Russia welcomes serious discussion of alternatives. From New Delhi came a reminder. India has long called for reform of the Security Council, and now perhaps reform might no longer mean asking politely, but building anew. From Brasilia came a voice of solidarity. Latin America, too, has grown weary of Western-dominated institutions, weary of being lectured while exploited. Africa itself spoke loudly and clearly. South Africa proclaimed, "This is the hour for continental unity." Nigeria declared, "Western extraction must be accounted for and compensated." Ghana spoke of a single African voice in international forums. Kenya lifted its eyes to the horizon, seeing in the Global South Assembly a vision of true international democracy. The map of the world was redrawn not with borders but with loyalties. The South aligned in solidarity. The West huddled in denial. The United Nations chamber had become a mirror showing the face of a divided world. And yet, brothers and sisters, the story did not end with applause or condemnation. For on the 15th of December, in the city of Ouagadougou, a gathering has been called. A conference to give flesh to the vision, to write into law what was spoken in fire. The question remains, will that day mark the founding of a new order, or will the old empires find a way to crush the seed before it takes root? Brothers and sisters, when Captain Ibrahim Traoré left the podium, he did not leave behind a void. He left behind a blueprint. He did not simply denounce the old order, he laid the foundations for the new. He called it the Global South Assembly. Not a dream, not a slogan. A concrete proposal with principles, with structure, with a date, and with a place. He described it in plain terms, an organization where every nation would have equal representation, where the voice of a small island would carry the same weight as the voice of a great power. No more vetoes in the hands of 5. No more tyranny of the permanent members. Decisions made not by empire but by majority vote. He laid out the pillars. A South-South development bank, offering loans without the chains of conditionalities, without the poison of structural adjustment. A global South court, able to hear disputes and rule on reparations, turning the weapons of law against the crimes of empire. A decolonization commission tasked with exposing and dismantling modern forms of colonialism, ensuring that exploitation could no longer hide behind treaties or technicalities. A South-South Security Council created not to impose domination but to mediate conflicts, to prevent wars without the bombs of NATO. And then he named the time, December 15th, 2025. And he named the place, Ouagadougou, the city of Sankharé, the city of revolution, the city where the torch of decolonization first blazed bright in the 80s. Think of the symbolism, brothers and sisters. Not New York, not Geneva, not Paris. Ouagadougou, a landlocked nation too often dismissed as small, now placed at the center of a movement to rewrite global governance. Already commitments have been spoken. Mali and Niger, bound with Burkina Faso in the alliance of Sahel states, declared their full support. China sent word of a preliminary delegation. Russia confirmed its attendance. India, cautious but attentive, announced it was studying the proposal with interest. Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea signaled probable participation. Across Africa, more than 20 nations raised their hands. In Latin America, 6 countries expressed intent. In Asia, Pakistan and Bangladesh joined the chorus. The list grew longer with each passing day. If 100 nations gather in Ouagadougou, they will represent more than 6.5 billion people, more than the entire population of the West combined. Imagine the sight, a hall filled with the majority of humanity, declaring independence not only in word, but in institution. But my friends, let us not be naive. The West has no intention of surrendering its monopoly quietly. Even now, its diplomats whisper threats. Even now, its banks prepare weapons of finance. Even now, its media sharpens its tongues. Divide and conquer, that old colonial strategy, will be unleashed again. Promises of aid will tempt. Threats of sanctions will intimidate. Propaganda will distort. Every tool will be used to stop December 15th from becoming a new Bandung. So the road ahead is steep, filled with obstacles. But history teaches us this: no empire lasts forever. No chain holds unbroken. No lie endures the judgment of truth. The question before us is not whether the West will resist. It will. The question is whether the South will remain united, whether Africa will stand firm, whether Asia and Latin America will keep faith with their own people. December 15th in Ouagadougou could be remembered as the day the South walked out of empire's shadow and into the light of self-determination. Or it could be remembered as the day opportunity slipped away. And so, the world waits, holding its breath, for the hour when history will choose its path. Brothers and sisters, let us look back at what was unveiled on that unforgettable day, September 17th, 2025. One man stood on the world stage, and in 47 minutes, he shook the